At this point, the Somali fraud in Minnesota has outgrown the meme. It has exceeded the meme's ability to describe it. Captain Phillips is now an insufficient comparison. These guys aren't operating rusty dinghies with even rustier AKs. Now they have waterfront property and yachts on Lake Minnetonka, or at least a sport boat, to be accurate with the charges. Maybe not a yacht, because after all, even this evolved, more sophisticated piracy still requires speed, first and foremost. But on that point, are these new methods of stealing really so much more sophisticated than the old methods? I guess most things are relative to the Horn of Africa, but is this theft really achieved through more skill, or is it just the victims continuing to allow it? Because the situation in Minnesota is like Captain Phillips never even bothered with the flares or the deterrent hoses anyway, and just anchored his ship and said, "Have at it, boys, and I'll be back tomorrow with another haul for you too." To avoid burying the lead, I'll get right to the headline before all the context, but of course this new piracy is so much worse than just the theft of our treasure. It's about where the treasure is going, because according to a new report from Ryan Thorpe and Christopher Rufo at City Journal, it is going by the millions of dollars to Al-Shabaab, the Somali al-qaeda allied terror group. Minnesota and federal welfare programs are getting ripped off to support the very Islamic militants creating the supposed need for these refugees in the first place. As one person quoted in the story says, "The largest funder of Al-Shabaab is the Minnesota taxpayer." And I guess that's why they need those fancy boats. They got to run all that cash all the way to the other side of Africa. More on the means in a moment, but first, a refresher tour through all the many repeated and massive frauds that have apparently made the terrorism business so prosperous through Minnesota. The lakefront property and sport boat guy is Abdi Aziz Farah, a leader of the Feeding Our Future scam. To date, the largest known fraud committed with COVID relief money, some $300 million. The supposed child nutrition charity received millions in grants from the federal government to feed hungry kids. But many of those kids not only weren't served, they weren't even real kids. They were just made up. The scammers manufactured names from listofrandomnames.com. They pocketed the money. They bought real estate in Minnesota, Africa, and beyond. They bought fancy cars and other luxuries. As of this week, 77 people have been charged in that fraud scheme, almost all of them Somali. And when the charges came, they even tried to scam out of the scam. They tried to use their fraud money to bribe a juror to acquit at trial, but that was caught too.
$120,000 in cash was dropped at the home of a juror in the Feeding Our Future trial. Ali's fingerprints were found on the bag used to deliver the bribe. Ali's rental car was seen waiting for juror number 52 to leave after court and then following her.
The Feeding Our Future fraud is the largest known and the most famous Somali fraud in Minnesota, but there are several more cases in recent years too. In 2020, Minnesota became the first state to offer housing assistance through its Medicaid program. The idea being helping the elderly, recovering drug addicts, the disabled, and other needy Medicaid beneficiaries find homes. The program started with just a modest $2.6 million in state spending. By 2024, the spending was almost 30 times more, $74 million. So what happened in 4 years to inflate the spending 30 times over? Did that many Minnesota Medicaid recipients suddenly need assistance in finding housing, or did professional scammers discover yet another scamming opportunity? With government medical payer fraud, as in Medicare or Medicaid, usually you'll find cases of overbilling, as in a real medical provider actually performed the services, but they're trying to scoop some extra money around the edges by exaggerating or misrepresenting. But this scam was something well beyond that. According to the federal prosecutor on the case, this fraud wasn't just a bad habit of an otherwise legitimate business. The fraud was the business. In August, the Minnesota Department of Human Services, the administering agency, stopped this housing assistance Medicaid program because of what they called, quote, credible allegations of fraud. The federal prosecutor says it's much more than just credible allegations. The program itself was mostly fraud. The businesses were fake, created for the sole purpose of defrauding the system. Their supposed offices were actually dilapidated, perhaps abandoned buildings, and they just scooped people coming out of rehab to capitalize. Hey, Junkie McGee! Now that you're out of the hospital, why don't you see if you can walk a straight line over here and I'll get you signed up for some housing assistance that I'll never actually provide, considering my supposed business itself doesn't even have a house. And I tell you what, if you do, maybe I'll even buy you some more drugs with the money we get. You help me, I help you. That's what happened. And as with Feeding Our Future, this Medicaid housing assistance scam was also predominantly a Somali operation in Minnesota. In September, the prosecutor brought the first round of charges, and 6 of the 8 charged are Somalis. But Minnesota Medicaid has been fraudulently fruitful otherwise, too. It isn't just housing assistance, it's also autism. Minnesota Medicaid offers compensation for autism therapy for kids, and so suddenly, lots of Somali kids became autistic. And many of the people pushing this scam were involved in the Feeding Our Future scam, too. How there's even time in the day for all this scamming is actually kind of impressive. The scammers rounded up Somali kids, convinced their parents to call them autistic, and in exchange for this sacrifice to the fraud op, the scammers gave the parents a kickback from the state money they collected, between $300 and $1,500 a month. And then, just like the supposed housing need, wow, autism exploded. Only $3 million in Minnesota Medicaid claims in 2018 grew to almost $400 million in 2023. Suddenly, 1 in 16 Somali kids was autistic, a rate more than triple the state average. And like Feeding Our Future and the housing scam, the autism scam is also a predominantly Somali operation. There are now 85 active investigations into these autism centers that exploded in the last 5 or so years. Of the closed cases, all are Somali. The scale of the autism fraud is not yet fully known. It's possible that fraud exceeds the Feeding Our Future fraud, actually. The Feeding Our Future fraud was something like $300 million. Minnesota Medicaid children's autism therapy claims since 2018 are $1.4 billion. So if even a quarter of the autism claims were fraudulent, the autism fraud is the new record. And certainly when you combine the operations of the free lunch scam and the housing scam and the autism scam, it is safe or at least plausible to think that the state of Minnesota has been scammed out of $1 billion plus by Somali fraudsters. So 2 questions. 1, not just how did this happen, but how does this continue to happen repeatedly? Well, it's not just speculation that weaponized and suicidal empathy is the problem. It's supported by the evidence. The Feeding Our Future scammers made that appeal in their bribery scheme. Oh, please, Miss Juror, we're just immigrants. After all, you can't be mean to us.
They also found lengthy instructions to the juror on how to convince others to vote not guilty, and it heavily plays on race. We are immigrants, it reads. They don't respect us and care about us.
In the indictment, it alleges that she was targeted for 2 reasons. 1, she was young, and 2, that they believed she was the only juror of color. Yeah.
And to fight the Feeding Our Future investigation, Amy Bach, now convicted of organizing that scam, filed a lawsuit alleging racism in the investigation. At trial, an FBI agent testified that the racism claims were a tactic deployed to keep the fraud going. And it's not just about browbeating overly compassionate politicians into compliance. At critical mass, it's about becoming politicians too, because with tens of thousands of Somalis moving into the Twin Cities area in the last decade or two, they now have political power of their own. Of course, famously, they have their own member of Congress. Feeding Our Future scammers donated to her. They appeared publicly with her, and her staff advocated on their behalf. Omar Fateh, the state senator who was competitive in the recent Minneapolis mayoral election, lobbied Governor Tim Walz on behalf of the Feeding Our Future program. One of those convicted in the Feeding Our Future scam was an aide to Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Fry. The second question, then, is the one that this City Journal report rightly asks. If it could be something like $1 billion scammed, what happened to all that cash? Because after all, there's only so much lakefront land to buy and so many fast cars to drive. And I notice that the Justice Department press release on the Feeding Our Future scam says much of the money was sent overseas and is therefore not recoverable. So where did it all go? Well, the luxurious properties are the least of the problem, actually. The worst of the problem is the terrorism. City Journal has several sources saying that, yes, The money Somalis stole from the Minnesota taxpayer and the federal taxpayer is going back to Somalia on a massive scale. Overall, in 2023, Somalis abroad sent $1.7 billion back to the pirate playground. That's more money than the Somali government's entire annual budget. Now, not all of that is fraud, and not all of that is going to Islamic militants, to be clear, but a lot is. The story cites Glenn Kearns, a retired Seattle Police Department detective who worked 14 years on a joint anti-terrorism operation with the feds. He says that through Seattle, Somalis from Minneapolis were running cash on commercial flights through hawalas, or clan-based money runners. His investigation led him to Minneapolis, where he discovered that Somalis sending money are getting much of that money from Department of Homeland Security benefits. It was welfare fraud. So yes, the Minnesotan and American taxpayer provided the cash, and yes, Somali Islamic fighters got the money. Al-Shabaab is an al-qaeda-aligned Islamic terror group in Somalia. Their ongoing fight with the Somali government and everybody else there is a major piece of the decades-long Somali civil war that is the supposed basis for Somali refugees even coming here. Ironically, we're apparently funding the war that is creating the supposed persecution that is bringing these people here in the first place. But whether through direct contributions or an Al-Shabaab tax once the money gets there, Al-Shabaab is collecting on all that American cash getting sent to Somalia. City Journal has a second anonymous source who worked the same joint investigation with the feds, confirming Kearns' claims. This source says for every dollar sent from the Twin Cities to Somalia, Al-Shabaab is taking a cut. A third source says it's not even just that Al-Shabaab is taking some of the money sent between family members or something like that. It's that the money is willingly given to Al-Shabaab because the ties to the terror group are so close. This source notes that of the 58 Americans who joined or tried to join ISIS in the 2010s, almost half came from Minnesota. And that source is the one that gave the headline quote. The largest funder of Al-Shabaab is the Minnesota taxpayer. The story doesn't describe specific numbers, but that is the nature and purpose of a cash trafficking operation. It's hard to track. And given the sparseness of wealth in Somalia, I think that claim is a very possible, if not likely, truth. After all, it doesn't take big numbers to set Somali funding records. So it would appear that the governor's friendships are far more sinister even than originally described.
I've become friends with school shooters.
He's become friends with Islamic terrorists. Their chief fundraiser, actually. And the political question now is how much more of this show will the Minnesota voter watch before another course is selected? Because Governor Tim Walz is running for a third term next year, so we'll see if Minnesota voters choose a sequel or not. I don't mean a sequel in his gubernatorial tenure. I mean Black Hawk Down 2. But I guess we already did that. We tried delivering food aid there, and they shot down our helicopters over it. So then we tried delivering food aid here, and that turned out to be a scam to buy more RPGs to shoot down even more helicopters. The one thing we haven't tried yet is Black Hawk Down, because it's still parked safely in the hangar, totally uninvolved with Somali affairs in any way. That's the movie I want to see, but I guess much like the sport boat on Lake Minnetonka or the rusty dinghy chasing after Captain Phillips, that ship has already sailed. Thanks as always for listening and for supporting this channel. Always appreciate that thoughtful discussion down below and especially over on X. That is at ML Christiansen. You're always welcome to coming out and chatting my live streams as live on Wednesday and Sunday nights. Looking forward to it. Goodbye.